Greetings all and welcome back to the Bionicle Community Podcast. I'm Keith Myers.
And I'm Huey Holmes.
And today we're going to be talking about some of the lost stories of ConStorm's Bionicle universe. That actually makes a pretty decent title. Make sure we write that one down. So today, what I'm going to be doing is going through the storyline that would have been Bionicle Zero's ending, the ending of Legend Begins, and the main storyline of Bionicle Panic in the Labyrinth. So, with that all set, let's go ahead and just very quickly recap Bionicle Zero. So, Bionicle Zero was basically a prequel of sorts that led us into the Legend Begins proper. Basically, Akima and Burkama, two halves of the same person, were sent to Okoto to train some new mask makers, so that way they didn't have to face the dangers of the island alone. During this time of training, Akima would come into his own as a fighter and would be able to successfully fight off the various skull villains. As a result, Makuta would get a little jealous about that, but would acknowledge that Akima did save him at some point in that fight. However, Burkama would accidentally stumble into the Shadow Realm during an exploration mission of his own as Makuta was training, and when he came back infected by something. This something is not going to be revealed until probably Risen Darkness 2025, just so you know. And as a result, Burkama notes that something's changed in him and he could be in trouble, but Burkama warns him not to try and absorb him. He knows his fate now, and that's to become part of him once more, and he wants nothing to do with it. As a result, Akima tries to stop him, but Burkama bats him away and returns to the Shadow Realm, leaving Makuta to his own devices. And back to Makuta and Akimu, Makuta gets fed up with Akimu getting all the glory for his masks, and tries to create the mask to end them all, the Mask of Ultimate Power. Of course, he does a few prototypes, mainly one that mixes fire and jungle power, which is a reference to Journey to One, and as a result, obviously, Akima would be watching this go down and would watch as Makuta accidentally burns a tree with it and promptly walks away as Makuta just ignores him for the most part at first. But knowing that the concept works, Makuta would begin merging these elements together. And as a result, things would start to get a little weird around Okoto, as slight distortions would begin to happen. But once Akimu takes note of the situation, he quickly rushes to Vakama, warning him that things have gotten bad, and Makuta has merged the elements, and Vakama would tell him, "I know what's going on, but I need you to go to the Temple of Time to see for yourself what the future is, and if there's a way we can fix this or not." So, basically from here, we would get Akimu in the Temple of Time, seeing various visions from future events, both Risen Darkness and Bionicle related, and very shortly after, the Mask Maker would go to the capital and have the collectors write it down, knowing what they know. Of course, if they would have known the city was going to get destroyed, they probably would have written it down somewhere else. But, back to the plot. Makuta is about to show off his Mask of Ultimate Power, and Vakama takes Akimu into the Awakening Chamber in the City of the Mask Makers. This allows Akimu to awaken his Toa of Light powers early, but as a result, they're going to be extremely unstable. So, as a result, the two of them quickly get back to the capital as Makuta is showing off his mask and its powers and whatnot, and Makuta puts the mask on once he sees Akimu, and releases what he calls his Zero form. And he uses this form to blow away the villagers so the two can begin their fight, and the two mask makers, right as they're about to go at each other, Makuta obliterates the entire city, leaving it in a smoky scape. And as a result, we get a huge fight between the two of them, a real fisticuff style event, and while Akimu is a little rough at it at first, since he can't really keep up with Makuta because he just got his Toa of Light form like a whole hour ago before this fight started, Makuta really looks like he's gonna win, but once Akimu finally gets serious and starts actually hard countering him with his light powers, it really looks like Akimu's gonna win for real, but his Toa of Light form starts to give out. So as a result, we get this huge back and forth stint as the two start to fade out of their full power and finally return to their protector states. And just as it looks like Makuta is going to win with a fatal strike, Akima pulls his hammer and manages to smack the Mask of Ultimate Power off of him, shattering it into 6 pieces, which will be important later. And so now all the 6 pieces are scattered throughout Okoto, and Makuta is on his back, about to fade into the Shadow Realm. So that's the recap. What do you think?
I think it all comes together pretty neat. You're blending a lot of elements from G2 and G1 in a way that is somewhat, interesting, I'd say.
Yeah, and also, if you want to watch this series for yourself...
There's also another element there with Burkama and Vakama, which is something that is completely, you made that,
Yeah, the idea of Burkama is to introduce an element of uncertainty into this story. And to be perfectly frank, I needed a legitimate reason for Risen Darkness elements to branch out of this, as we'll get to with Part 11. So, speaking of which, we are now on to Part 11. Yeah, I know, probably could have animated this, but after really looking through this, there's a good chance that Part 11 could be Part 11, 12, and 13 with how much stuff happens. So let's go ahead and...
It is jam-packed.
Yes, so we're going to go ahead and go through it all first. So for the Part 11 portion of the story, it would have opened with Makuta fading into the Shadow Realm and Ikimu starting to lose his color, as his light energy has left him at a point where he's basically about to go to sleep for roughly 500 years. And as a result, he would quickly gather the Mask of Control, which somehow didn't wind up destroyed in this fight, and would send it away into the Labyrinth with the help of the elemental creatures. After this, Vakama would accompany the Mask Maker in his last hours to his tomb, as he fully fades to gray, being sealed in the tomb after, and the Mask of Creation, I don't like where it was hidden in the 2015 story. Like, leaving it on a bridge, that was asking for it to get stolen. So I think what I'm going to do is have it hidden in a different place, somewhere more a little off the beaten path. I'd say it gets discovered accidentally by Kolta when he's trying to take over the city, so maybe somewhere in the city of the Mask Makers that didn't get fully wiped out. I don't know. But from here, this is where things would really start to cool down for a minute, as Vakama would finally admit fault for not handling the situation better to the villagers, and would tell them of the Prophecy of Heroes, which would summon new Toa models needed to counter potential future threats. And this prophecy, this prayer, was actually a message that was sent to Artaka, the creator from the first Bionicle series, and he was actually working on new Toa models. I believe in 2008 they did kind of potentially hint at that, but I'm not really sure where. But basically, these new Toa models would share the same name as their originals because, well, I guess brand recognition. Maybe Artaka was weird like that. But during this time, Vakama would enter his own self-imposed exile in the multiversal hub to begin his new tenure as Guardian. As a result, we would get a time skip of 500 years. And during this time, I think this is probably where Part 11 would end. If I had to make this into a script, this is probably where this would end. So from Part 12 onwards is basically Risen Darkness content, so if you're not here for that, you can feel free to skip to the Legend Begins recap. But if you want to stick around, let's get into it. With Part 12, our story would open with the end of the time skip. Vakama would go on to meet Contro, the son of Bota Magnus Toa of Light Variki. And I know it's kind of weird to introduce Variki in this story, considering he was a Gen 1 fan character, but I just think it'd be appropriate, Toa of Energy, Toa of Light. I think it makes sense. So Contro would request to train with Vakama, noting the success of the Toa of Light in defeating the most dangerous threat in the universe at the time, and Vakama would agree, but he would discover something really strange about Contro's inherited power from Variki, and this would be the power to absorb any kind of energy, from natural energy to life energy to element energy, you name it, he can absorb it. And as a result, I guess Vakama would start having some second thoughts and warning him against fighting Burkama in a real legitimate fight, as he would also reveal to Contro the life link that him and Burkama share. If one of them dies, the other goes next. That's pretty much, so it's not unlike the Supreme Kai to the Destroyer connection from Dragon Ball, if you think about it. So from this point, I feel like Contro would ignore this order, and he would attack Burkama one-on-one, with Makuta also watching on, sitting by in a much bigger, more lumbering body, his journey to one body, basically, as punishment, because he did try to undo the damage. He tried to get the city back to the main world, but Burkama wanted nothing of that, and basically left him in this weird, lumbering state for his failure to deal with Akima properly. This is where Burkama's full evil at this point. But Contro would absorb Burkama's power to the extent that Burkama is within minutes of death. Like, this could have ended the entire lore right here if he had just gone a little further. But right as Contro's about to put him down for real, the situation turns as Vakama stops him and manages to parry him away from the body of the very, very weakened Burkama. And during this time, Vakama would then face Contro in a fight to try and get him under control. But he too would start to become weaker, getting his own power absorbed by the threat. And with no other choice in the situation, the two halves would have to work together to fight back Contro, or at least get the energy back that was lost. Of course, this was to no avail, because Contro could just hold it, and they weren't getting any stronger at this point. Contro's power had gone way out of their control, and there's nothing they could do. At least until Burkama suggests a time-based sealing technique that would banish Contro to the end of the multiverse, trusting Vakama for the first time in years. Now keep this technique in mind, it'll be important for Cataclysm. So from here, Vakama would don the Mask of Time, and Burkama would channel the time-space energy that Umarak accidentally used to get his people away from the crashing boat of Magna, and the two, after a very, very back-and-forth fight, would finally seal Contro away at the end of time, ending his threat for the time being. So this would probably be the end of Part 12, as the two would just go their separate ways, going, this isn't over. Clearly, we both have a screw-up to our names now. So I guess they're kind of equal in that respect. So what did you think?
I think it's very inventive, trying to tie in your own material with the established canon in this kind of multiversal, bridge the gap kind of way.
Yeah, that, and the 500-year period between, well, I don't know, I think it was I want to say it was 500 years, but it could have been 1,000. Like, there could have been that could have been the main time skip that before the Toa arrive. But yeah, I'm just going off 500 years in this situation, just to make sure just to try and add a little point, so that way we don't just go straight from part 11 to the legend, basically. Yeah. So, on to part 13. This is where we would really start to get into the Risen Darkness prequel stuff. And in this situation, the two would part ways, still unwilling to merge with each other into one entity after the disaster on Okoto and the disaster with Contro, as a quiet proxy war would begin. And with the discovery of the X3 AI by Burkama, as I guess he decided to travel the universe for a while to try and figure out if there's any way to undo the damage that Contro did. And basically Berkama would start building up his army. Meanwhile, Vakama has taken on a new student again, but opting not to teach him remotely anything as dangerous as the technique he taught Contro about how to master his energy draining. He would take on the human Dagra as a trainee, and fearing what his potential could be, just kind of takes it back toward, kind of takes it easy. He doesn't teach him a lot. He just teaches him how to control his basic energy, how to fire basic energy blasts, and how to fight. Dagra wouldn't take too kindly to this. In fact, he would actually get rather impatient with the idea that Vakama was holding back on him when Berkama explains to him that he's afraid of Dagra's potential. He knows what he could become after the disaster with Contro, and decides to actually try and poach Dagra from Vakama. And Dagra would willingly go along with this. Meanwhile, Berkama, now having the X3 AI and a number of other villain characters from various projects who would come later, would decide to go ahead and challenge Vakama one more time to another secession fight. And this one would be a sword fight between the two of them. So while Berkama is still significantly weakened, he's still strong enough that he is able to go back and forth pretty cleanly in this fight. However, Vakama does get the jump on him and manages to take his arm off and finally slash him in the left eye. And while he was seconds from stabbing him through the chest, Dagra intervenes in the fight. A big no-no in a secession fight. And as a result, Motunui comes down and says absolutely not, and promptly knocks Dagra out. So he's pretty much donezo for the moment, and he is sealed away in the Dark Labyrinth as Berkama is basically sent back to the drawing board, realizing, I can't do anything this way. So he basically returns to the Shadow Realm, goes back, works with the rest of the villains to start handling this proxy war in a different means, invasion. Because the secession fight went completely out of Berkama's plan. Dagra wasn't supposed to get involved. I think Berkama knew what he was trying to do. He was probably going to try and basically merge with Vakama to override him from the inside. And this obviously didn't happen because he basically lost. So from here, that's basically where this would end. Is Berkama just working with X3 to figure out what they need to do next. And a smaller scene at the end would show Vakama discovering Kane, the Vaki, from the Risen Darkness / Hero Origins projects, and working with him for a while. Now, I'm not going to say this would be a montage, but it would be a montage-esque thing that would happen over the course of the credits scene. And that would basically be the end of Bionicle Zero. It would end with Vakama with his own set of students, and Berkama ready to go with a whole army of his own. So that's how Bionicle Zero would have basically ended. And we'd also have a post-credits scene of the meteors from one of the episodes of the Lego animations finally crashing onto Okoto and the Toa Masters officially arriving. So that's basically it. Quite the story, all things considered.
I think one question is, how do humans fit into this?
Well, the lore reason for why Berkama has come to have issues with the humans in this situation is because of X3. He would be monitoring X3 at the time and would notice that X3's math regarding the humans and how much of a dangerous threat they've been to their planet has honestly left him a little worried, these guys could potentially become strong enough to be a problem for him later, and this would be hinted at throughout the course of Part 13. And as a result, Berkama would program X3 very, very quietly to start eliminating the human race, and so we'd get the Dark Timeline events, the EAS scenario that would have basically explained how X3 eliminated 98% of the human race and only a few people would escape.
Sounds pretty spooky to me.
Yeah, basically it's a loose connection, but it's a way to bring the humans into the Bionicle story, as the human species could realistically exist alongside Bionicle in a very, very broad sense. Like, I'm literally grasping at straws here. So, now that that's been settled, let's go ahead and move on to the next story. Bionicle the Legend begins. So basically, this was my attempt to adapt the 2015, right? 2015 Bionicle story? Yeah. Okay. So basically, The Legend Begins was my attempt to adapt that story. And I'm not gonna lie, biggest mistake here trying to do it weekly. Definitely could have had a lot more effort put into it had I just put a little more time, maybe spent a month on each episode to make them look as good as possible. Otherwise, it wouldn't have stalled out at episode 9. So, really quick, just as a recap, basically, the Toa Tahu lands in the fire region. Narmoto speaks with him for a little bit. A skull warrior named Skulker and some skull spiders enter the fire village, forcing Tahu to fight off Skulker as the Protector fought off the spiders. And as a result, this is where the two would begin their mission to go up into the volcano to find Tahu's mask, and basically it would be a straight adaptation from the Lego story, except Skulker would show up gradually throughout to try and fight Tahu in a sort of Team Rocket way. I think that's what I was going for at the time. And as a result, well, it would just the ways of him getting defeated would just get more and more ridiculous, ending with assumingly Tahu getting his golden mask and knocking Skulker into the lava. But unfortunately, this doesn't work, because once Tahu meets up with the others and defeats the Lord of Skull Spiders, which is episode 9, which is like episode 8. In episode 9, they would have to fight a powered-up version of Skulker with a golden mask and a red rib cage. And basically, he's been overloaded by the elemental energy during this process and turns into a giant hulking monster of sorts that the team cannot fight. They would have to get into the city and somehow get him to take out the bridge, and they, in that regard, succeed. Skulker winds up falling into the chasm, not to be seen for the rest of the series. This is basically episode 10 would have been his last episode, basically. So episodes 11, 12, 13, and 14 would pretty much be the various Toa facing the various skull villains, getting their masks stolen, awakening their berserker forms like Tahu had, and going on their own respective perfection-style fights to learn to fight without their masks. And as a result, they would defeat their respective skull villains, and that would bring us to the last 5 episodes of the story, where I want to say episode 16, I think, is what I had planned to be a crossover with Risen Darkness, where Akima would have seen the Toa, and things would have been kind of weird, because Akima would be fighting fire gradually across the island, trying to get to this fulfillment point to infiltrate Project Babel, and Liwa would help Akima locate this point in exchange for trying to figure out where the graveyard is that Akima was in. Of course, this means you would get Akima and Liwa versus the Skull Scorpions, instead of all of the Toa fighting them, which means that Akima would probably blast one of them away, and Liwa would have used the sign on top, just like in the animations, to crush the other one. And so the other Toa would catch up and awaken Akimu. As Liwa and Akima continue their journey to the fulfillment point, they meet up with Fire Blast again, and Akima and Fire have their last fight of the story. And Akima would manage to blow off Fire Blast's leg and leave him assumingly for death. Like, by all accounts, this should have been it for him. But there is a little something that would have happened in, like, this arc in Risen Darkness that I'm not going to get into here, but it has something to do with Umarak. So basically, Akima would be out of the story once he gets to the fulfillment point, and the episode would end with Lewo returning to the Masters as they get ready to fight the Skullbasher in episode 17. So from here, episode 18 would be the Toa versus Kolta. Now, yeah, there would be this. You'd have this prologue fight with the Skullbasher. Onua trying to go at him all at once, but losing his mask in the process. But because the rest of the Toa are able to work together at this point, they're able to blast him just like in canon, and he gets smacked into a wall and he's done. So from here, they would enter the Mask Forge right as Kolta was about to drop it in. And when Kolta realizes that he's been caught, he's left with no choice but to put the mask on. No, because this is the Legend Begins design, he would have had a cape and he would have been a lot taller and a lot more intimidating. So all of the Toa would work together using their berserk forms, which they have some control over now. Now, bear in mind, the berserker forms are, functionally speaking, a predecessor to the uniter forms. Think of them as imperfect uniters. That's basically what this was. So they would go back and forth. They would really, really try to get Kolta knocked down as Akimu's finding his mask, but unfortunately, it doesn't work out too well, as Kolta finally gets fed up and blasts all of them at once using the power of the Mask of Creation, and manages to greatly damage each of their masks. And this would pretty much go the same as in canon as well. At least this situation. They would all try to fight without their masks, but because they're all basically exhausted, Akimu is left with no choice but to use his hammer that he's able to find after rummaging through a nearby box, basically. And at this point, he very briefly, like a couple of seconds at most, is able to power into his Toa of Light form and punch him so hard that he gets embedded into a wall. So that should have been it for him right there. He should have done. I know he's a skeleton, but that probably should have finished him off. And luckily, he basically releases the mask right there. So after Akimu falls out of his Toa of Light form, he quickly scurries to the mask and gets it on his face and starts fixing the other mask as quickly as possible. As Akima comes in wondering, oh my gosh, what the hell happened here? And Akimu explains to them, there's not much time. You need to help me get Kolta contained. We have a huge situation on our hands. So Akima would basically bind Kolta up and basically walk away. He just wanted to make sure everybody was alright. And he disappears shortly after. So that would be the end of episode 17. You'd get a prologue, Skullbasher, and then the main event. So from here, we have episode 19 and episode 20. This is called The Skull Raiders' Revenge. This is basically Escape from the Underworld, told in 2 episodes. Golly gets kidnapped by Skulker, and the rest of the Toa have to go rescue her while Akimu's working on some new armor for the Toa. And it basically plays out the same way it did in the novel. It's basically an adaptation of that book. So, I guess at the end of episode 20, when Akimu does come in, he winds up using his Toa of Light form, now with the Mask of Creation, to smack Kolta into the ceiling and basically collapse the entire thing on them. And while Kolta would yell out for Makuta to save him, Makuta would just look on going, you had one job, Kolta, you should have just dropped the stupid mask in the forge, and left it at that. Now, the lore reason why Kolta would be told to drop the mask in the forge is mostly to hide it. Like, they wouldn't be able to destroy the mask that way. It's basically meant to contain it until until Makuta can begin his own process of escape, which we'll get into next. But at this point, the Legend Begins basically would have ended with the Skull Raiders being done. Would have been totaled completely. You wouldn't even see them in the next arc. They'd be that screwed. So, what do you think of that one?
I think you do a competent job of inserting your own story in between the story that we see on screen by Lego.
Yeah, that's basically what the plan was. And while I feel like, though, to be honest, the Berserker forms drew from Maystar Media at the time. Now, this is before I realized he was a complete lying piece of crap. So, basically, if I were to redo this now in like a zero timeline version, if they wouldn't awaken Berserker forms, they would just awaken the full power of their golden mass and, like, get transparent fists or something to put down their respective threats with their own power, though the majority of this would have played out the same as it did in canon, just with some little odds and ends here and there. So, with that done, let's go ahead and move on to the last story of this volume, Bionicle Panic in the Labyrinth. Now, Panic in the Labyrinth is pretty much a beat-for-beat adaptation with Journey to One. Except the main difference is that the big fights with Umarak would not be Liwa versus Umarak, but it would be Pohatu versus Umarak instead, as he would try to come to terms with his own creature, trying to befriend it even. So basically what would have happened, the way the story would have opened is the Toa would be sparring to test their new Uniter powers, and Umarak would launch an attack on them with some elemental beast as a distraction. The ones from late in Journey to One. Basically, Umarak would have access to those because Burkama gave him access. And from here, they would be beat back by Pohatu alone with his new power, and Umarak would just leave them alone for the time being after that, noting that Pohatu usually prefers to work alone, and deciding that he's going to be his target. Okay, so from here, after this little scuffle with Umarak's minions, Akima would give the Toa the mission to find their elemental beasts, but I'm just going to say it right now, we wouldn't do the Golden Mask. It just seems redundant to have another Golden Mask hunt right after we just had one. It just doesn't sound right to me. It never has. So, basically, that would make up the first 4 after episode 1. I guess that's how episode 1 would end, is with Ikimu giving them that mission, and episodes 2 through 4 would be the group going after their respective beasts. So a short scene would follow in episode 5 with Umarak talking with a very injured but still alive Fireblast who is adjusting to his new prosthetics for his right arm and his left leg. What is discussed is not known for now. And later on, an episode would be dedicated to the Toa meeting their beasts, as I just said, and Pohatu meeting Qatar being the main plot, and Umarak trying to get Pohatu and Qatar separated so he can steal that creature from him, as, again, Pohatu usually prefers to work alone, so this is probably going to be the main issue here. And basically we get a short fight between the two of them. And as a result, Umarak learns Pohatu's range, his combat style, and learns that he can only work with Qatar very reluctantly. So at the end of this episode, Umarak would finally pull back, realizing I've seen enough for now, and disappear again. So in the next episode, the Toa would have met back up at the city, and Akima would tell them, "Good job. That's step 1 of 3. Your next mission relies on you all being able to work together in the Labyrinth to find Makuda's mask, the Mask of Control." And that's basically how the episode would start. The team would have to work together to get to the island, because in this version of events, there's something guarding the island. I think I decided it was going to be a character from Hero Factory who got stuck there at some point, probably a crash landing before the events of the story kicked off. So we just decided to watch over the maze until he could find the Mask of Control for himself. So this would be Jawblade versus the Toa, essentially. I know it seems really weird to do that, but having something guarding the mask makes a lot more sense than having just a giant labyrinth. So,
yeah.
So the majority of that episode would be the Toa getting to the island and fighting their way through Jawblade to get the door open into the labyrinth. So after that, we'd move on to the next stage, which would be the labyrinth. This would be about 2 to 3 episodes long, and something would be hunting the Toa, a red figure with a prosthetic arm and leg, basically Fire Blast. And with a brief moment, I guess Fire Blast would once again scope out Pohatu, trying to contain Qatar for him, because again, there's that reluctance, and basically Pohatu would have to fight against a being who can, to an extent, control some aspect of time. So this would really show Pohatu's natural combat talent, and while he would win this fight, it would be very close. Of course, Umarak manages to blitz him and knock him out before he gets too caught off guard and steals Qatar from Pohatu. As the other Toa meet up with him to discover what's going on, the second part of the story would unfold, as Umarak would enter the place where the Mask of Control is held, and he would get the mask and throw Qatar off before vanishing into shadows. He wouldn't jump out of the maze and have a fight after. He would just go back to Okoto through his shadows. That's kind of how broken he is. Now, yeah, Qatar would be revealed to be okay, but Pohatu realized that he can't let his reluctance give him any more trouble. He has to handle this way better from now on, or it's going to be the death of all of them. So that would be the end of the Labyrinth mini-arc of this story. After this, the Toa would return to Okoto and notice a suspicious sight. Nothing's been destroyed. So yeah, we're basically going way off the Journey to One story here. Nothing's been destroyed, and they return to the city. Meanwhile, Umarak is asked by Makuta what happens now. Well, I mean, Umarak asks Makuta what to do now, and Makuta tells him that he has permission to don the Mask of Control for the time being to gain his Destroyer form and start hunting down the pieces of the Mask of Ultimate Power, and this would take us into the main second act of Panic in the Labyrinth. As Akima gets done speaking with Vakama in spirit, he decides to restore his life form once again to help the Toa, because now that they know, because Akima has been watching through Agil what has happened, and is told by Agil, basically, that, hey, Umarak's going after the Mask of Ultimate Power with his elemental beasts. You may have screwed up in the Labyrinth, but here's your chance to redeem yourself. And so the Toa split off into their regions to go get those pieces before Umarak can. And so the next few episodes are spent trying to find the pieces of the Mask of Ultimate Power and defeating the elemental beasts for real this time. And while the Toa are successful to an extent finding most of the pieces, they can't seem to find the last one, because it turns out Umarak was wearing it. And while Umarak is able to pull the parts from the Toa and open a portal to the Shadow Realm to release Makuta, the Toa would try to fight against Umarak, but they'd have to get through the invading beasts first, as they were meant to guard the portal until it was fully complete. So we'd get this Elite Four style progression fight, as the Toa tear through the elemental beasts as quickly as possible, but once they get to Umarak the Destroyer, they find something else weird. Makuta telling him to take the mask off. At this point, Ikimu's just completely confused, like, wait a minute, this isn't right. And with a sudden flash of light, Makuta returns in his Zero form, along with a lot of entities from the Shadow Realm, but they're not attacking anybody. Yep, basically Panic in the Labyrinth was going to be a cop-out ending. I know it seems kind of lazy to do that, but honestly, I didn't like the way Journey to One ended, just on account of they just shot back up into space. So instead, we would get a very short moment, a very short incident at the end of episode 15, which would have been the last episode of Panic, where the Toa would use all of their power to just blast through Makuta, praying that something would hit him. But this is a Makuta who has had decades to centuries to master his elemental control. So he just blasts the energy into the sky like nothing happened and said, enough. I'm not here to fight. and he decides to fly off into the distance and creates a whole new island for the shadow entities to go live on, deciding that they were just not going to stay on Okoto. And Akimu simply asks why, and Makuta tells him, I understand what I did, and I think I was out of line. I didn't need to blow up a whole city to prove a point. And so, basically, for the time being, you get this very reluctant truce between the Toa and Akimu with Makuta and his band, as Burkama simply sits in the Shadow Realm because he can't leave yet, and simply asking himself, I hope that Makuta did the right thing, because it's time for my plan B. And this would lead us into the third arc of, well, the third main arc of Bionicle, with, I want to say, a very strange development that we're not going to get into here. But, yeah. This would pretty much be it for the time being. Now, I don't want to say that Panic in the Labyrinth was going to have the best ending of these projects, but frankly, it seems a lot more reasonable that Makuta would realize after the centuries spent in confinement that maybe he did do something wrong. He didn't need to prove his power, he was already capable enough. But now there's a lone Burkama with a full knowledge of the world outside because he's monitoring everything through his shadow entities. So, from here, the next 3 arcs would really happen. So, Huey, what did you think of this? Do you think it seemed a little messy, or was it pretty stable?
Well, I think you do a lot of something a lot of fans do with their stories is when they don't like something about the given fiction, they decided to change it to better fit their own perspective.
Right.
And I think the ending you described reminds me a lot of the ending of Transformers Prime.
Where the two sides just decide to let things go for the time being?
Well, kind of.
Well, according to my timer, we're at 42 minutes. So what do you think? Do you think I could give a general rundown as to what happens after this, really quick?
Sure.
Okay. Storyline 3. The Shadow Tournament. Basically, after Panic in the Labyrinth, Makuta has set up his own kingdom hundreds of miles away on an island that was greatly damaged during Crossfire because Akima and X3 had crashed a space station into it during their own fight, and Makuta realizes this might be able to work if I use my elemental power to adjust it properly. And so he set up his Shadow Kingdom there, while Burkama has been hard at work with the rest of his forces after X3's destruction to try and lure a new band of Toa to his side. And as a result, Burkama manages to do something with Umarak's powers. He manages to tap into them and open a shadow portal to Spherus Magna. And during this time, he corrupts Onipu to his side in a bid to get the Toa Nuva to his side as well, so he can capture the Toa Uniters. And in this process, he succeeds. He uses the Toa Nuva to do just that. And so the basic opening of the story is exactly that. The Toa Nuva capture the Toa Uniters in the most ridiculous situation possible. Experience versus hilariously inexperienced in this situation. Mm-hmm. So, as a result, things are kind of looking a little rough for the most part. And Akimu now has to form a new band of folks to go into the Shadow Realm and rescue the team. So, throughout this process, Akimu would find Akima, his master of Akama. He would, I don't really know who else I selected for the team list, but I know Axon was on it. And it was going to be like a few others. But basically, it would have been Akimu, Makuta, Vakama, Akima, and Axon, basically going into the Shadow Realm, praying that the Toa were still alive. And lucky for them, they were, but their powers were being drained for something that Burkama is hooked up to. And this is the main ploy that Burkama was doing, to capture the Toa Uniters, drain their power to get him back up to full strength. That was basically the main part of the opening of this story. So, in celebration of his newly minted full power, Burkama challenges the Five to a shadow tournament with some of his best tribes. And so the rest of this story arc is basically the team going through the Shadow Realm, fighting these best tribes of the realm in a battle royale style fight, ending with Ikimu fighting Takanuva, the giant one, the one with the shadow leeches. And while Makuta does help him manage to hold back one of his attacks, and even uses his journey to one form to actually fight, but Ikimu realizes that Makuta is about to be killed by Takanuva in this situation, and in a moment of just pure anger, he unleashes the Toa of Light power in a way that no one had ever experienced before, not even the Toa Nuva. Well, for the most part. Takanuva's seen death, but he didn't expect to be the one dying, as a lightning blast hits him through the chest, and he goes down hard. Because of this situation, Burkama realizes, oh, you're no better than I am after all. Vakama's prized student is a killer. Only for Ikimu to just tell him, we beat your championship, let them go. And Burkama does just that. With the snap of a finger, he drops the Toa Masters and just basically leaves them there and just lets the team take them away. He got what he wanted. He's now back to full power, and now we're going to step into the endgame of the ConStorm Bionicle timeline for the most part. Because from this point, things get pretty dark. Basically, Burkama manages to finally escape the Shadow Realm now that he's no longer being degraded by being in the real world for any length of time. And he's able to resurrect a part of Akima that was destroyed in another storyline known as the Black Tyrant. And as a result, we would go into Bionicle's 4th series, Rise of Black Akima, and basically this is pretty much a plot reason for Spherus Magna to no longer exist, pretty much. As what would happen, the way it would open, is not too dissimilar to Dragon Ball Super's Future Trunks arc. Basically, Nuparu would be running through the streets of a Spherus Magnan city, trying to avoid Black's attacks, basically, and using this strange temporal device. It's not the Mask of Time, it's something else, to try and open a time-space portal to Okoto to try and save as many people as possible. And as a result, throughout this opening episode, you would see the Toa and Nika start getting wiped out. First Kongu, then Huey, then not Matoro, because he's already dead. Then who else? As far as Toa and Nika, who else? Axon. There we go. Axon would officially be killed off in this arc. He would be the second to last stand against Black, but he'd get blown up too. And finally, once Nuparu reaches Hali, the two manage to finally make it to safety, only for Black to go into the building that they're in and manage to blow it up, and it's assumed that Hali is taken out, but luckily she's barely alive, and Nuparu manages to beat away Black long enough to escape, and using the temporal transition device to throw them to Okoto, they all manage to escape with their lives. So from here, once Nuparu lands, things are pretty much in a really bad spot for Spherus Magna. They don't know why this guy is going around and destroying the planet, but they're basically left with no choice in the matter but just hope that they have something on Okoto that can help them. And as a result, we wind up at Okoto, and what happens here is when Nuparu wakes up, he finds the real Akima sparring with the Toa Masters. They're not Uniters anymore because they just had their power drained to the point where they can't do that anymore. They don't have that form. And it turns out that armor that Akima forged was element-based, and so that's gone too. So right now, Akima is trying to teach the Toa how to tap into their uniter powers as individual forms instead, so they don't have to rely on resources to do it themselves. And so from here, basically Nuparu would kind of freak out a little bit, thinking, oh crap, did he follow us through? And he would try to swing at Akima, with Akima just being very confused, going, I have no idea what's going on here. What are you attacking me for? But after things get settled down and Akimu finally speaks to Nuparu about the situation, Nuparu simply just responds, some version of him is going on a rampage on our world and we need help. And so Akima agrees to help, and Akimu, who can now power into his Toa of Light form at will, agrees to help as well. And while Makuta would be watching from his island, he would decide to stay out of it, knowing full well that whatever Burkama just got to replace him is way stronger than he is. So as a result, basically you would see Akima, Akimu, and Nuparu all going back to Spherus Magna to fight Black. And during this time, things would get a little out of control because they would try to fight him. They would all try to go at him at once, forgoing the basic concept of fairness when somebody's literally destroying the planet. And while Akima would be taken a little off guard by the mirror match situation, Akimu would be the first one up to bat against the human deviant, basically. And we'd get this back and forth fight with them for a bit, but unfortunately, poor Akimu basically gets a blade in his chest, not unlike Vegeta from Dragon Ball Super, and is basically taken out of the fight for a pretty decent length of time, as Burkama comes down and simply says, alright, Black, you've done whatever long enough, and tells him to wipe the rest of them out so they can get moving. And of course, we'd get this huge four-way fight between Nuparu, Burkama, Akima, and Black. And it would just go back and forth for a little bit, but unfortunately, Black has had a lot more training now that he doesn't have that damn sense of good and evil getting in the way. And as a result, he's able to overpower an Akima, who does have access to the god form at least. And as a result, it's not looking too good for the human, until someone intervenes. If you recall, I never specifically said that Fire Blast died in The Legend Begins. In fact, after his defeat, he actually left the planet with his prosthetics intact and decided to pursue power into the greater universe, and this is what led him to the element of destruction. Because of this, Fire Blast alone is able to deflect the full power of Black and Burkama just long enough for the other three to escape, and quickly teleports after them to avoid any more trouble. So, acknowledging the situation and how dicey it all is, they all just decide to move on. And Akimu, in a pretty sorry shape after what Black did to him, just says, I'm staying behind, you guys can handle this. And Fire Blast and Nuparu go alone. Or Jollar and Nuparu, because he's shed his Fire Blast persona at this point. He's back to being a Toa, albeit a Toa of destruction is a lot different than a Toa of whatever Jollar was. So, from here, things would get way more dicey, as Nuparu would once again manage to fight Black to a standstill, and Fire Blast, or Jollar now, manages to catch Black's last intentionally attempted to kill punch before it could really do the job on him, and he erases Black Akima from existence. So he's out of the story. I know it's a cop-out to wipe him out like that, but we're getting really close to the end of the story here, so we're just kind of haphazardly pushing it along now. So at this point, what would happen? Well, this is kind of the bad thing about not making notes for this arc, is from here, Burkama would just snarl at the Destroyer Toa and go, if that's the best you can do, you have no chance against me. So, in a last-ditch move that honestly scares the heck out of Jollar, Burkama releases the most energy a being has ever unleashed onto a planet, and right as he's about to throw it, Jawler teleports Nuparu back and tells him, "Get ready, this fight's about to get 1,000 times worse." And Burkama destroys Spherus Magna. So that is officially out of the story, and pretty much everyone who survived this arc is now on Okoto. So from here, this is where we get a big intergalactic fight scene. You have Burkama fighting Destroyer candidate Jawler from planet to planet until they manage to trail their way back to Okoto, and just as it looks like Jawler is about to win, unfortunately, Burkama manages to pull a fast one and reverses Destroyer energy onto himself, which turns him to stone, and he starts to disappear. So basically, in this big finale fight of Rise of Black Akima, basically Burkama ultimately wins, and we slip into the final arc of ConStorm's Bionicle lore, with Burkama now in the orbit of Okoto. He lands on the island with no issue at all. Now, of course, during the fight between Jawler and Burkama, the Toa managed to regain their full Uniter forms and even perfect them to the point where they were able to protect the Okotan planet from a lot of the monstrous attacks that were being thrown around, because they're now like element lords, basically. So they're able to manage to keep things stable and avoid any further disasters. But because of this, Motunui now wants them as his personal guard. And Akima wonders, wait, who's going to protect Okoto then? And Mata says not to worry about it, because they now have a much bigger issue to worry with, as Burkama is now above them. And knowing the situation is basically going to go two ways, they either fight and die, or they submit and maybe die? I guess from here, Vakama just says, "Enough. I submit." And that's it. From here, Vakama and Burkama would go to this place called Unity Island. And at this point in time, things are genuinely looking really bad, because they don't know what a Burkama with full, complete power is actually capable of. Like, if a half Burkama is strong enough to defeat a God of Destruction candidate, what the hell kind of chance do they have against him now? And so, Akima, Kane, Dagra, Foita, and Archer, who I suppose would be introduced sometime in the Renegade stories, would all go to this realm, this place of Unity Island, with the Toa, in one last all-for-nothing move to try and get this sorted out. And so, we would go into the final fights of the lore, with if you've seen Shaman King, you might know what's coming. Basically, what happens is as bodyguards to Motunui, the Toa Uniters are now going to have to fight against the team that is going to try and stop Burkama from becoming whole. And so, throughout this Unity Island arc, you would see various Toa fight the various heroes, and this would be a bloodbath. I want to say everyone except Akima winds up dead by the end of the story, as each of the Toa would manage to take out at least one member of the team through various gruesome means. And while Akima would ultimately kill off the last of the Toa in this situation, including Akimu, which is actually kind of a shocker, because it is alluded to that a superhuman can fight a Toa of Light to a standstill, but it was never really decided in the Renegade story if a Toa could actually defeat a superhuman for real, as that would have been a whole thing that happened as a side plot. But basically, after Akima beats his way through the Toa and awakens his Ultra Instinct to fight Burkama, the merge completes. And it genuinely looks like all hope is lost. Burkama is going to snap his fingers and reset and rework the universe as he sees fit, as Guardians who are of Motunui's level can now do that. And it really seems like it's over, but something snaps inside of Burkama's merged mind, and he discovers that Vakama's still in there, and the two have a chat for a little while, discussing the redundancy of this entire situation, the hopelessness of this war that they've gone and done with themselves, and really wondered what's going to happen now, because with both of them merged into one being, there's still the potential threats of the future who can be stronger than them. And while this little moment would be used to hint at Contro and, at the time, Selza, because Horus wasn't really a concept at this point, what would happen from here is that Berkama would realize, you know what? You're right. I don't think I am ready to be dealing with a Contro who could potentially break out, or anything of that sort. And so, Berkama forfeits control, and Vakama Prime is officially born. And so, the Bionicle lore, for the time being, would come to an end with Vakama awakening as Vakama Prime, which is a white Metru version of the character, who is now able to undo all of the damage from the Unity Island, the Rise of Black, and so much more, and decides to just snap his fingers and bring back everyone who died in the Unity Island assault. And he tells Akima that to look after the world for him, because now he's on his own thing. He's pretty much just at his decisions are his own now, and he's got his own life to live. And so Vakama takes on his throne as Motunui disappears for good, feeling that he has found a worthy successor to take his role on long term. So that's how basically my ConStorm Bionicle lore would have ended, or maybe it could be used for a new version of events. But I don't think there would be a post-credit scene of any sort, as the Bionicle story is one of those things that just sort of continues on its own, regardless of what you do. I'm sure anybody could have come up with their own thing after this. So, what do you think of these last 3 arcs?
I think there's a lot of content there, and this time it's pretty much all you know.
Yep.
There's not a lot of input from the story itself.
No, because Gen 2 really didn't... Gen 2 ended in a very stupid way. They just basically blasted Makuta off into the sky, and that was the end of that. Bye, Makuta. Nice knowing ya. See you in a few decades for the next reboot. Ugh. Just didn't like that idea.
Yeah, it appears we aren't getting a Gen 3 of any real sort. The Gen 3 that we did get is basically just 3 figures, isn't it?
Pretty much, yeah.
And one of them is a minifig, of course.
Yeah,
a Duplo-looking minifig, goofy guy, you know?
Yeah, but really, I think the biggest issue with this is that this got really ambitious. I think that's the reason I shelved the idea, is once we started getting into the Unity Island arc, or really just the Black Akima arc, things were going to go way out of control, because you're introducing planet and multi-planet level situations that you would have to be incredibly powerful to sort out.
You might want to learn Blender at that point, you know?
Yeah, that, and honestly, I was pulling a lot from that. I'm not gonna lie, I would have been pulling a lot from Shaman King and its manga continuation at that point too. So I'm sure some people would be drawing comparisons and complaining, "Oh, you copied from that." But I'd prefer to think of it as an homage.
Yeah.
But otherwise,
so
yeah.
You definitely should learn Blender as not a replacement for the stop motion.
It would be a good complement. But a little fun fact: when I was first making Bionicle Zero Part 8, I was actually in talks with somebody to add 3D elements to the fight, like Makuta telepathically lifting rocks to throw at Akimu, and there was some combat scenes of that recorded, just to give him a reference to what to work with. But sadly, nothing ever came of it. The guy never contacted me again, so that's unfortunate. But
that's what happens. There's a lot of people who will show up and say, "Hey, man, I want to work with you on this and this and that," and then next week, ghost it.
Yep, pretty much
happens every day, you know.
Yeah. But
I've
this
seen
is,
projects just die, and people are like, "Wow, this is devastating." You know.
yeah, unfortunately. But really, if I do go to revisit this, Bionicle Zero and everything that follows up after, I think I have an idea what I want to do. Risen Darkness 2025 is basically going to have a very, very shortened version of the Berkama lore. To the point, mind you, that while the basic plot is the same, the Toa basically aren't in it at all. It's pretty much Akima mastering the sword and trying to become Guardian the entire way. Just because
That
there's
sounds pretty
too many
good.
parties otherwise.
I'd
But
like to see more of Akima. He's pretty cool. I remember they gave him the nickname Leg when we
yes,
were
Shade
doing
gave
the
him the
Portals
nickname
collab.
Legs. And it makes
Do you
sense
like
too.
the?
Like, I'm gonna level with you. When I
Yeah.
built that mock way back in 2013, there was a reason it was so tall. Those were the only parts I had at the time. I had gotten the Hero Factory sets for Christmas from my oldest brother's wife before they were married. I believe she got them at Kmart back when they were still open. I am not kidding. So that was probably one of the better Christmases, actually. And as a
It
result,
sounds
I
like it.
was able to slowly start building out this weird concept of a world, this basic idea for one. And of course,
Mhm.
sorry, I was in grade school when I was doing this project. So, you could probably guess why I had so much trouble making making it a reality until now. It was largely just because I didn't have time. And while I do want to revisit Bionicle Zero in the future, because I'm probably going to have to introduce Contro after whatever I decide to do with Cataclysm, because I do want to do that plot line, but I also want to do some other world building first to explain why is Horus doing what he's doing, and why is he tampering with timelines, basically. And then we'll revisit Bionicle Zero after that to introduce the next big bad, somebody that even Berkama was scared of. So for
Yeah,
now,
it really is.
go
Yeah,
ahead.
good.
No, you first.
Yeah, it really is something, isn't it?
Yes, it's quite the story. I'm not gonna lie. It is weird to go back. It is weird to bring this all out to the public now, knowing how much of it I could do these days without too much issue. But considering how much of it is drawing from anime, I really don't know if I could do Bionicle story as it is at the moment. Because having the Gen 2 life cycle be Protector, Toa, frickin' Toa God, is something that would definitely take a lot of work to explain.
Mhm.
But otherwise, I think that,
Well, you could just be like Dragon Ball and not explain anything.
yeah. Yeah, well, if they did that, then that's kind of the bad thing about Dragon Ball is, yeah, they do like to write by the seat of their pants, and I guess because a lot of this stuff was coming out in was originally planned to go out in 2017, 18, and 19, I guess I could say I was writing by the seat of my pants too in this situation. But I feel
Yeah.
like this reboot of the ConStorm universe should clean up a lot of that. So, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I do. It's over 9,000. Actually, it's only over 8,000, but only manga fans know that.
Haha. Well, we've actually crossed over an hour for this, so I'm actually kind of surprised we were able to keep this short. So, folks, if you listened all the way through, mad props to you. You were one of the few. But otherwise, I feel like basically don't get ambitious with your animated projects. Just go one step at a time, and in the words of Mania Mac, write a script. You're gonna give yourself a huge headache if you don't. Or, in his
Sounds,
words, you're gonna hate yourself if you don't.
yeah.
So for now, thank you all for watching, and we'll see you all next time. Have a good one.
See ya.
Links
Links
below.
below.